Most of us don't share our stories. Oh yeah, we share bits and pieces of carefully constructed, carefully crafted narratives. We share the ideas of us that we want and that we hope others see. But our real stories? No, we don't share those. Instead, we share the carefully crafted one-liner Facebook update. We share the carefully selected tweets. We share those social media posts. We share those updates that paint some picture of who we wish we were, that paint some picture of who we are trying to tell others we are, even though that's not really us. That's what we share. We often live behind a facade. There's a facade in the front of our lives. There's a facade that is separating the real us from the public. And so what we're doing every single day is perpetuating a myth. We're perpetuating, in some ways, a lie. I hate to sound so harsh to say that we're perpetuating lies, but in some ways we are, because we are sharing these made up stories about ourselves that really reflect nothing about us. They're not even remotely related to who we truly are. Yet those are the stories we share. Those are the narratives we share. The stories of our wished for lives, the stories of our made up lives. Those are the stories. But I am sharing this podcast with you today because I want to impress upon you the need for you to tell your story, for you to share your true, your real, your authentic story, because somebody needs to hear it. You need to tell it. Now, this isn't about simply going, oh, I was born in 19 so-and-so, and I did this when I was 1 year old, this when I was 2, this when I was in first grade, this when I was in second grade. No, I'm not talking about a chronological accounting of every single instance of your life. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sharing who you really are. Not the made up you, not this image of you, not this, again, this facade that you may have put up. I'm talking about sharing who you really are, telling your story, sharing your essence, because somebody needs to hear it. You see, our stories are the only unique things about us in the world. There are 7 billion of us on this planet, but no two people have the exact same story. So even if someone has had similar experiences as you, their story is not the same as yours. And so your story has merit, your story has worth, your story has value, and it needs to be told. And of course, you know, I am doing this work of greatness. I am helping you to realize your potential for greatness and to set your greatness on fire by doing something amazing in your life. In today's podcast, the subject of doing something amazing revolves around telling your story. I believe if you tell your story in an authentic way, that can be something amazing. That can be a tool that you can use to touch other lives. You can use to be able to make a real difference in the world, because there are some lessons, there are some blessings, there are some messages wrapped in your story that somebody needs to receive. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any period of time, you know that a large part of my work is related to the fact that I help people create products, specifically books. I help people do a lot of books, and often I'm helping clients to turn their life stories and their messages into books in some way so that they can reach others. And so that's why I'm talking to you today about telling your story. But maybe you don't need to tell your story in book format. It's not limited to a particular format. I just want you to tell your story. Maybe you do tell your story in a book. If so, if I can help you, I will be happy to do that. But maybe it's about telling your story in your blog. Maybe it's about telling your story in your podcast. Maybe it's about telling your story from the stage. Maybe it's about telling your story through speaking engagements. Whatever it is, look at a way to be able to package your story, to be able to share your story with an audience that needs it. Turn your story into a product that can become a solution for others, something that you can use to help others in their lives. Your story is there to not only be lived by you, but is there to be able to touch others' lives. No matter where you are in your life, no matter who you are, you already have a story, even as you continue to live out that story. Because you see, our stories are made up of themes, and they are made up of lessons. They're made up of blessings. They're made up of messages. It's up to us to be able to find those themes in our lives, to be able to find those lessons and those blessings and those messages and package those in a way that others can relate to and can receive. So, are you ready to peel back the layers of your life? Are you ready to step around that facade and finally step out as the bold person you are? Are you are you ready to become naked? Are you ready to become naked, stripped bare of the facade, of the lies, of the myths, of the carefully constructed narratives you've already been sharing? Are you ready to finally just share your story in all of its imperfection and in all of its glory? Are you ready to finally own your story? Are you ready to acknowledge your story so that you can stand up boldly in it and say, this is me, this is my life, this is my story? It's scary, I know. It's scary to finally peel back the layers of the facade. It's scary to finally acknowledge the truth of your life. It's scary to put your story out there for others to possibly judge. I mean, after all, that's why you created that facade. You created that facade because you don't want people to judge you harshly. You don't want them to judge you poorly. You don't want them to judge you and find you lacking. That's why you had the facade in the first place. But now it's time for you to lay aside the facade. And it's time for you to embrace the truth of who you really are and to own that and to walk in that and to share that story. Now, that doesn't mean you have to share every single gory detail of your life. That doesn't mean you have to intentionally embarrass yourself for the sake of sharing your story. I'm not suggesting that. We all have a right to privacy. And when you're sharing your story, you get to keep part of it to you if it's not relevant to the telling of that particular element of the story. But what I am saying here is that don't be afraid to own your story in its imperfection. Don't be afraid to finally acknowledge that you don't get everything right, you haven't gotten everything right, and it's okay. One of the things that you can do when it's time for you to share your story is to look at what you want to accomplish by sharing that story. Many people, when they think of sharing their stories, when they think of telling their stories, and I know because I've had a lot of them to come across my desk in my work as a ghostwriter and as an editorial consultant and content creator, I see a lot of people whose aim in telling their stories is all about stroking their own egos. And while ego is important, and while that's okay if that's what you want, when you are telling your story in a business context, it has to be more than about your ego. It has to be about the person you intend to reach. So look at, as I said, why you're telling the story, what you want to accomplish with it. What do you want to do as a result of telling your story? It has to be more than simply, I want to talk about how great I am. It has to be that I want to offer help or hope or service or a solution to the listener of my story or the reader of my story or the viewer of my story. So if you are ready to tell your story, and I hope that you become closer to being ready to tell your story as a result of this podcast, if you are ready to tell your story, start with asking yourself, why do I want to tell this story? Who do I want to help? How will my story help that reader or that viewer or that listener? You ask that question because that will help you to shape the content of that story. It will help you craft the story. Because this is the thing. When we are telling our stories, as I said earlier, it's not just about going, oh, I was born here and I did this and I did that and I did that in a chronological way. That's not it. That's boring. We all have mundane things that go on in life. People aren't reading, they're not listening, they're not viewing our stories to find out about our everyday mundane activities. They are consuming our stories because of something contained in those stories. They're hoping that somehow our stories will help them in some way. So forget going chronologically with your story. Look at the themes of your story. Look at the lessons of your story. In fact, once you decide why you want to tell that story, the second thing I would like for you to do in preparing to tell that story is to look at your experiences that lead up to a certain theme. What is the theme going on in your life? All of our lives have certain themes going on. So it's up to you to kind of figure out what that theme is and to craft your story around that theme so that there's some central idea that you are sharing. There's a thread that goes from the beginning of the story you're telling all the way to that last page of that story. So what is that theme? Is your story one of overcoming hardship? Is your story one of hope? Is your story one of inspiration? Is your story one of guts? Is your story one of grinding out something and almost being ground up as you fought for a goal and finally reaching that goal? Is that your story? If so, that's a story of perseverance. That's a story of hanging in there against the odds, somehow getting beaten up, getting pummeled, but still coming out on top. That's the story of perseverance, and that's a story somebody needs to hear. Is your story one of somehow being blindsided by something that came seemingly out of nowhere, that almost laid you flat, but you had to somehow come and regroup and to create a whole different reality for yourself, to come out on the other side of that thing in somehow a better way? If so, then maybe that is a story of realization and of resurrection. Maybe you had to realize some truth and that truth almost destroyed you, but somehow you were able to rise up out of that situation. Somebody needs to hear that story. Is yours a story of somehow going along as if everything was great, everything was fine, and then one day it all changed? It was all taken away. Everything that you knew yesterday that was good suddenly didn't matter that next day, and you had to somehow figure out a new reality for yourself? Is that the story you need to tell? Is that the story you need to share? If so, maybe there's a story of not just surviving, but thriving, coming out of that new reality. Whatever it is, look at your life and look at the themes that you see showing up, and then pull from your experiences, the different anecdotes that are related to that. And there you can craft a life story around those experiences, those similar experiences, because they are all about that same theme. And what you can do is, when you are crafting that life story, when you are sharing those experiences, number one, make sure you just kind of write down the details of that particular anecdote or that particular vignette, so you can keep them fresh in your mind, and they may indeed turn into your book or whatever product you're doing. But in addition to writing down the details of that particular experience, write out the lessons that came from that experience, the pointers or the tips, whatever you want to call them, that came from that experience. So if you are telling a story of somehow being blindsided by something in your life, perhaps it was, infidelity, and on Monday, everything was going great for you, and somehow on Tuesday, everything changed because you realized that there was this piece of infidelity that came into your life. Well, maybe coming out of that story, you talk about the 3 pointers or 3 tips for figuring that thing out. Because as you look back over that story, you realize that maybe there were clues earlier that you just didn't see beforehand. So maybe those are the pointers. Those are the tips you share with your reader. 3 tips or 5 tips or whatever it is or 3 clues to infidelity. And so not only do you have that story, but then you also have help for your reader. You have the 3 or 5 or whatever clues that they can look for so that they can somehow make sure that that's not going on in their relationship, or if it is, then they can figure it out. Or maybe your story is one of somehow being told by the doctor that you were suffering a grave health issue that was going to shorten your life if you didn't do something about it. And so that visit to the doctor just really jolted you up right and really got you to finally moving. Yeah, you knew beforehand that you probably weren't eating the healthiest way. You weren't really exercising. Maybe you had other unhealthy habits. Perhaps you were smoking or maybe drinking too much or whatever it was. But that visit to the doctor just really kicked things into gear for you because the doctor told you that if you didn't make a change right now, you would be dead soon. And from that day, you started to make that change and you transformed your life to change all your vitals to get on the healthy side of the equation and to do whatever the doctor said that you needed to do so that you fixed your health. So tell that story and then give the 10 points to transforming your health, or give the lessons that came out of that experience so that you are giving something new to your reader. You're sharing your experience, of course, but you're also sharing your insight. So look to your story for that. So number 1, you're going to ask yourself why you want to tell this story. Number 2, you are going to look for the themes in your life so that you can settle on a theme in the story that you want to share. Number 3, you're going to look for the various anecdotes, the various vignettes, the various experiences in your life and write those down so that you have a series of short stories to be able to share in your overall life story. And number 4, you're going to make sure that you're pulling lessons out of those experiences. So you're pulling tips or clues or whatever you want to call them from your life stories, from your experiences, so that you're giving some insight or some solutions to your reader. That's why you need to tell your story. That's why it's important for you to share your story, because your experiences, while they may be common to others, perhaps your insight, perhaps your perspective, perhaps the ideas that you have coming out of those experiences are unique and need to be shared to help other people. That's why you tell your story. Now, don't get me wrong. This isn't about just telling your story just because you have had a painful experience. It's not just about the pain. Nobody's reading your story because of the pain. They're reading it because of the promise. People need to hear your story, not because of the pain you experienced, but because of the promise. They need to receive your story, to hear your story, to view your story, to learn of your story because of the promise. Because if you were able to make it through, if you were able to survive, if you were able to somehow overcome, that gives them the hope that they too can survive, to make it through and to overcome. That's why you need to tell your story, because your story can be something, can be a tool, can be a resource to reach, help, and serve others. Consider telling your story, considering finally peeling away the layers, finally stepping aside and around that facade that you've built in front of your life, finally deciding to be authentic. Decide to tell your story because you know someone needs to hear your truth. Someone needs to receive your honest message. Someone needs to know that even if things weren't perfect at one time, even if things were downright awful, they can get better. And your story can illustrate that. Your story can perhaps even give them insight and to give them a solution and to give them direction so that they can overcome their challenge because they heard you and learned from you how you overcame yours. So don't be afraid to tell your story. Again, I'm not saying you have to go and tell every detail of your life. Nobody's interested in every detail. But go in and find the theme in your life. Look for that area where you can really lend some insight. First, of course, find out why you want to tell the story. Find the theme that seems to be going throughout your story, as I said, whether it's somehow a story of overcoming or hope or inspiration or perseverance or whatever it is. Then look for those experiences and those anecdotes in your life to be able to illustrate that theme. Be sure to find the lessons and the blessings or the insights or the tips or clues or whatever it is coming out of that story so that you can, in addition to sharing the story, you can also give your reader some insight. You can tell your reader some clues or some in addition to some clues or some tips or some tools or some resources or lessons or whatever it is that you felt that came out of that story, you can give that to your reader so that he or she can apply those lessons to his or her life. Tell your story. Craft your story because somebody needs to receive it. And your story can be a solution to someone else's problem. That's how you're able to tell your story in business. From telling your story, then you can somehow maybe create a product around it, create a program around it, or simply use that insight or the perspective shared in your story to help others in some way. So your story, don't let it go to waste. And certainly don't continue to waste it by living behind what's not true, by living behind this facade, by continuing to present this carefully constructed but completely made up idea of who you are. That's not helping anyone. Share the real you. Share that story. Share that insight. Share those solutions because somebody needs to hear your story. Somebody needs to receive your story. Somebody needs to be blessed by your story. And know that as you share your story, it's possible that many lessons can come from one story. I remember once helping a client tell his story, and his was a story of overcoming drug addiction, overcoming life on the streets as a result of the drug addiction, and building a successful multi-million-dollar drug treatment facility to help others get off drugs. That's a powerful story. But many thoughts can come out of that story. Number one, of course, is a story of overcoming. He somehow was able to overcome a serious drug addiction. But it's also a story of great success. He was able to build a multi-million-dollar business, a multi-million-dollar organization. And that's the aspiration of a lot of people. So many people can probably be able to gain some insight from that part of the story. But it's also a story of service. When he was deep in his drug addiction, it was just about him. It was about his selfish desires. Everything was about feeding that addiction. It was nothing about other people. But once he was able to get on the other side of that addiction, he felt the need for service. And so he answered the call of service in his life by building a drug treatment facility to help other people get out of the addiction. So his was a story that had many layers. And so any one of those themes could have been the dominant theme for his story, whether it was overcoming, whether it was this financial success in business, whether it was this idea of service and personal transformation. So it may be for you. When you look at your story, you may see several themes going on, and that's fine. Look to see which one is the most dominant theme and which one helps you to be able to accomplish your aim of helping people in some way, and look for the experiences that support that theme. So your story can have many facets. It can have many pieces to it. It can have many angles to it. And that's the beauty of our stories. And if we keep living long enough, sometimes we might think of one story and see one lesson come out of it. But if we live long enough, when we think back on that same story, we see another lesson coming out of it. So yes, you can have one story with 2, 3, even more lessons coming out of it, more insight coming out of it, more ideas coming out of it. That's the beauty of our multi-layered lives. That's the beauty of our multi-layered stories. So how are you going to use your story? How are you going to share your story? How are you going to share this real and true part of you with the world? What are you going to do to share your story? Are you going to turn it into a book? Are you going to blog it? Are you going to take it to the stage in a play or in speaking engagements? Are you going to use it in your career? Use the insight in your career in some way? Are you going to do a podcast around it, helping people in some area that you feel you can help them because of your story? Where is your story going to show up in your work? What are you going to do with your story? Who are you going to help with your story? Your story is not just to be lived. It's to be shared. So go out there and tell your story. Share your story. Allow your story to be the resource, to be the tool, to be the help that somebody else needs. I've helped a lot of clients tell their stories, and I can tell you there is such an immense feeling of satisfaction and of joy when you finally get that story out, when you finally share that story and you have people to come to you and say, oh, thank you so much, I really needed that. Who needs you to tell your story? Who needs to hear your story? Who needs to be saved because of your story? Go tell your story. Go share your story. Stop living behind the facade. Stop living behind the veil. Stop living behind what's not true. Own your story. Own your reality. Tell your story. Share your reality and transform somebody else's life.